Inconsistent communication patterns, not the occasional missed message or late reply. Everyone gets busy. The pattern worth paying attention to is when someone is intensely responsive for a few days and then disappears without explanation, cycling through this repeatedly. In online dating, this rhythm gets normalized quickly because the medium itself is informal, but sustained inconsistency in how and when someone communicates usually reflects how much priority they're actually assigning to the connection, regardless of what they say when they do respond. The warmth of the good days can make the silent stretches feel like anomalies. Over time, the cumulative effect is a relationship built around uncertainty rather than steadiness. Vague personal details. A person who's been talking to someone for weeks but still can't answer basic questions about their life, where they work, what their daily life looks like, whether they live alone, is offering something that resembles intimacy without the substance of it. In online contexts, some caution is reasonable early on, but vagueness that persists past the point where trust has been reasonably established suggests that either the details don't match the story being told, or the person isn't interested in being fully known. Both matter. The specificity of someone's life is part of who they are. When it stays permanently out of reach, what's being offered is a curated impression rather than an actual person. Reluctance to video call. Text and voice calls are easier to manage than live video. The face is harder to control, the environment reveals context, and the interaction is harder to exit gracefully. Someone who consistently avoids video calls, always citing timing, connection issues, or discomfort with cameras, after weeks of daily messaging is leaving a gap in the picture they're presenting. For long-distance relationships especially, video calls are one of the primary ways of maintaining real presence across distance. A sustained reluctance to use them removes one of the few tools available for genuine connection and, more practically, for confirming that the person on the other end matches who they say they are. Love bombing. The feeling of being intensely pursued can be genuinely difficult to read clearly in the moment. When someone declares deep feelings very early, makes sweeping statements about the future, and creates a sense of urgency around the connection, it often feels like evidence of rare compatibility. The distinction worth making is between someone who is naturally expressive and enthusiastic and someone who is moving at a pace designed, consciously or not, to create emotional dependency before the relationship has been tested by time or difficulty. Love bombing tends to be followed by withdrawal or demands because the intensity was never sustainable. The contrast between the early phase and what follows is where the pattern becomes visible. Talking about an ex excessively. Bringing up a previous relationship occasionally is normal. Past experiences are part of who someone is. The signal worth noting is when references to an ex appear frequently, carry unresolved emotion, or seem to shape how the person defines what they want or don't want. In long-distance or online relationships, where there's more time spent in conversation than in shared activity, the proportion of a person's inner life that shows up in messaging tends to be higher. Someone who is still psychologically occupied by a previous relationship will surface that preoccupation in ways they may not fully recognize. The concern isn't the mention, it's the weight. Isolation tactics. These rarely begin as obvious demands. They tend to start as mild expressions of discomfort. Comments about how much time someone spends with a particular friend, questions about why certain people are still in their life. Small observations that create a subtle pressure to explain or justify existing relationships. Over weeks, those comments accumulate into a reshaping of the person's social world. In online relationships where the remote partner has no visibility into daily life, this can be especially effective and especially difficult to challenge because each individual comment seems minor when taken alone. The goal, whether conscious or not, is to reduce the number of people who might offer an outside perspective on the relationship. Humor used to deflect. Everyone uses humor to lighten difficult moments. The version that functions as a red flag is humor deployed specifically to avoid accountability. When raising a concern gets met with a joke, and pressing past the joke gets framed as being too serious or too sensitive. Online, this pattern is particularly easy to maintain because tone is already ambiguous in text, and a person can claim after the fact that something was never meant seriously. Over time, the person raising concerns starts to self-censor because they've learned that sincerity will be redirected. The relationship becomes one where certain conversations simply can't happen. Unexplained unavailability at consistent times. Everyone has parts of their schedule that are naturally busier or more private. The signal worth examining is when someone is reliably unreachable during specific windows, the same evenings, the same days, and the explanation for those windows stays vague or changes. In the context of online or long-distance relationships, where availability is one of the few ways presence is demonstrated, patterns of unavailability are more significant than they would be in a relationship where both people share physical space. A person who is managing another relationship, a different identity online, or circumstances they haven't disclosed will often reveal that through the shape of their availability rather than through anything they say directly. Dismissing your concerns as overreaction. A specific kind of invalidation occurs when one person consistently reframes the other's concerns as disproportionate responses. responses, not by engaging with the concern and explaining a different perspective, but by redirecting the conversation toward the fact that a concern was raised at all. You're being paranoid. You always do this. I can't believe you're upset over something so small. In online relationships, where the evidence for concerns often comes from patterns in messaging rather than observable behavior, this deflection is easier to sustain. The person raising the issue already half doubts themselves because the evidence feels intangible. Having that doubt confirmed by the other person accelerates the process of disregarding their own instincts. Financial requests before meeting. The request itself is rarely framed directly. It typically arrives inside a story, a crisis, an opportunity, a situation that has emerged unexpectedly and that only this specific person can help with. It comes after enough time has passed that genuine emotional investment has developed, which is precisely the design. Romance-based financial fraud is one of the most reported forms of online fraud globally, and it operates through exactly this sequence. Build connection, establish trust, create urgency, make a request that feels like an exception rather than a pattern. The request is also often small at first. The purpose of the first request is to establish that requests can be made, not to extract maximum value immediately. Needing constant reassurance without reciprocating. Some degree of needing reassurance in a relationship is understandable, especially early on or during uncertain periods. The imbalance to watch for is when reassurance flows consistently in one direction. One person is regularly asked to confirm their feelings, their loyalty, their commitment, while the same energy is never offered back. In long-distance and online relationships, where the absence of physical presence creates genuine uncertainty, this dynamic can grow quickly. The reassurance seeking can start to feel like care. Over time, the person providing it may find that nothing they offer fully settles the anxiety, and that the requests are escalating rather than decreasing as trust is supposedly being built. Monitoring and checking behavior. Asking where someone is, who they're with, or what they're doing is normal in the context of caring about someone. The version that signals something else is when those questions arrive with regularity and require justification, when the expected response is a full accounting rather than a casual answer. In online relationships, monitoring often takes digital forms, commenting on who liked a post, asking why a response took an hour, checking whether someone was active on a platform when they said they were busy. These behaviors tend to be framed as expressions of love or anxiety rather than control, which makes them harder to identify clearly in the early stages. A life that doesn't quite add up. Not dramatic contradictions. Those are usually easy to spot. The subtler version is a collection of small details that never quite form a coherent picture. The city they mentioned early on doesn't match a detail from a later conversation. The timeline of a story shifts slightly when it comes up again. The job they described doesn't quite fit the schedule they keep. Individually, these inconsistencies feel like nothing worth raising. Collectively, they suggest that the account being given is assembled rather than remembered, a constructed narrative that requires maintenance rather than a lived one that tells itself naturally. The instinct to give the benefit of the doubt is reasonable. Ignoring a pattern because each piece is small is different from genuine charity. Conditional affection. The connection between affection and compliance is sometimes visible from fairly early on. Plans get made and then hedged, depending on whether recent interactions have met some unstated standard. Warmth appears after agreement and cools after independence. Responses come quickly when the conversation is going the way one person wants and slow down when it isn't. The conditioning doesn't need to be conscious to be real, but over time it trains the other person to manage their own behavior in ways that maintain the warmth and avoid the withdrawal. By the time the pattern is fully visible, it's often already shaped how that person communicates, what they share, and what they keep to themselves. Resistance to any future planning. A relationship with no future orientation exists only as a present tense experience, which can feel freeing until it starts to feel like a ceiling. Someone who consistently deflects questions about meeting in person, redirects conversations about where things are going, or responds to future talk with vague enthusiasm, but no actual movement is communicating something through that pattern. In long-distance and online relationships, a concrete plan to close the distance, even a distant one, provides a kind of anchor. Its absence, especially after significant time has passed, tends to mean either that the person isn't as invested as the daily messaging suggests, or that there are circumstances preventing commitment that haven't been disclosed. Speaking poorly about everyone in their life. A person who has no positive relationships, who describes every friend as unreliable, every family member as toxic, every ex as a villain, is offering a version of their social world in which they are consistently the wronged party and everyone else has failed them. This pattern matters for two reasons. The first is that it may be accurate in some cases, but the uniform distribution of fault is statistically improbable. The second is more immediate. The framework someone uses to understand their past relationships is likely to be the same framework they eventually apply to the current one. The qualities they currently describe with fondness tend to become the grievances they articulate later, once the relationship has moved past its early stage. Testing behavior. Some people conduct small, deliberate tests of their partner's loyalty or reactions, then observe the results without disclosing what was happening. They might mention someone attractive to gauge a jealousy emergency response, go quiet for a period to see how the other person reacts, or create minor situations designed to check how someone behaves under low pressure. The practice reflects a fundamental distrust that precedes the relationship itself. Rather than building trust through transparency and experience, it attempts to verify trustworthiness through surveillance. The problem is that people respond to the situation as they understand it, not the situation as it actually is. Test results are inherently unreliable because the test itself is hidden. Discomfort with your independence. Someone who becomes visibly unsettled when a partner has a good day that didn't involve them, who responds to independent plans with subtle withdrawal, or who frames personal time as a form of rejection, is signaling that the relationship is expected to fill a role that relationships aren't designed to fill alone. In long-distance contexts, where a partner's daily life is largely invisible, this discomfort can surface as suspicion or as a low-level pressure to keep the other person continuously updated. The dependence feels like closeness. The distinction is in what happens when the closeness has natural gaps, whether those gaps are tolerated as normal or treated as problems that need to be solved. Minimizing the relationship to others. The experience of being in a relationship that exists fully in private but barely at all in the other person's visible life is a specific kind of dissonance. Someone who doesn't mention the relationship to their friends, whose social media presence gives no indication that anyone else is in the picture, and who becomes uncomfortable when asked about it directly, is maintaining a version of their life in which this relationship either doesn't exist or doesn't count. Long-distance and online relationships are more vulnerable to this because the partner has no natural presence in the person's daily environment. They don't appear in passing, aren't introduced at gatherings, and can be kept entirely separate without much effort. That separation isn't always malicious, but when it's consistent and unexplained, it reflects something about how the relationship is actually being held.